Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hopefully you guys can hear me out there okay. My name is Vernon Foster. I'm on the content development team here at Acast. And I'm so happy that you have decided to join us. Before we get started, just a little bit about Acast, and then I'll introduce our creator and moderator for today. Acast was founded in 2014 and is one of the most eminent podcast platforms and a pioneer of the open podcast ecosystem, connecting podcasting stakeholders to a common software infrastructure. Through that infrastructure, Acast allows advertisers to effectively target, engage audiences, and listen through ad insertion, while podcasters are given access to a range of monetization opportunities and the necessary tools that they need to expand their listener base. The company has a global footprint across 12 countries, and during 2020 had approximately, check this out, 3 billion listens on Acast connected podcasts. Today, Acast hosts more than 30,000 shows. And I'd like to take this opportunity now to introduce our guest curator and moderator, Dr. Pamela Palmater, who is a Mi'kmaq lawyer and member of the L-Bar First Nation. She has 4 university degrees, including a doctorate in law focused on Indigenous law. And she currently holds the position of full-time professor and chair at Ryerson University. She is the producer and host of 2 Indigenous podcasts, Warrior Life and Warrior Kids podcasts. Please allow me to introduce you to our curator and our moderator today, Dr. Pamela Palmer.
Awesome. Hello, Kwe, Tanse, Sego, Ani Buju. Hello and bonjour, everybody. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. My name's Pam Palmater. I am a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and podcaster, and my Warrior Life podcast helps lift the voices of Indigenous land defenders all over Turtle Island and reach out to kids on the Warrior Kids podcast to celebrate everything Indigenous. I have the great privilege to chair today's event, the first ever Acast podcast masterclass featuring amazing Indigenous podcasters. The panel is called Seen and Heard: Indigenous Storytelling Through Podcasting from Beginner to Expert. And we all know that the podcast industry is growing rapidly. There's more shows, more creators, and a million more opportunities than ever before. As of 2021, there were more than 2 million podcasts and over 48 million podcast episodes, and about half of all homes in the US and about 40% of all homes in Canada love podcasts, and those numbers keep growing. While the majority of podcast listening is done at home, more and more Americans and Canadians are taking their podcasts to the gym, on walks, or while driving to work. And many of our podcasts now are even being used in classrooms. Now is the time for the podcast community to come together to help ensure that Indigenous voices are amplified, our stories are told, and Indigenous cultures are celebrated. The aim of this session is to give new Indigenous podcasters, or anybody who wants to start podcasting, a space to learn from others who've done so already and help give them some firsthand tips. So this is how the podcast session is going to go over the next 60 minutes. First, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists. Then we'll get right into our conversation, and we'll save some time at the end to answer some of the questions from you in the audience that you might have about podcasting. And then we'll have to close our event sharp right at the end. But first, don't forget, if your mics are on, mute them and click the 3 dots in the corner in case you want to just have a profile view of what's going on, and you can hide all the non-video participants. So let's get right into it. Now, today's Indigenous podcasters are hardcore rocking podcasts right now. Our first guest is Ryan McMahon. He is phenomenal. He's an Anishinaabe comedian, writer, media maker, and community activator from Koochiching First Nation, which is in Treaty 3 territory. He's the founder and CEO of Macoon's Media Group. Ryan brings Indigenous stories to light through conversations, research, and investigation. He provides all of his audiences with in-depth and challenging analysis of the Indigenous experience and the reconciliation movement. He inspires audiences to play their part in building a more equitable country. Some of Ryan's work, and I'm saying just some of his work, is the Thunder Bay podcast on Canada Land, Stories from the Land podcast on the Indian and Cowboy Podcast Network, and the Red Man Laughing podcast. And he does so much more. And if that wasn't amazing enough, we also have the indomitable Falen Johnson. Phelan is Mohawk and Tuscarora from the Bear Clan, from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. She's a writer, podcaster, and radio host. Her plays include Salt Baby, Two Indians, and Ipperwash, for which she received a Dora nomination. Her writing has been featured everywhere. It's in The Brick, the Canadian Theatre Review, Granta Magazine, just to name a few. And she's also written for Urban Native Girl, one of my favorites on APTN, and Merchants of the Wild, APTN, Aboriginal People's Television Network, and the 2020 Inspire Awards on CBC. No wonder she was named One to Watch in 2020 by Maclean's Magazine. She hosts The Secret Life of Canada on CBC Podcasts with Leah Simone Bowen. And she's also guest hosted on the amazing Unreserved, Day 6, and Q All on CBC Radio 1. She's literally doing so many things. I don't know how they do it all. And rounding out our incredible panel is Natalie Welch. Natalie Welch, or as some of you might know her, Dr. Nat, is originally from Cherokee Indian Reservation in the mountains of Cherokee, North Carolina, and a proud member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. She grew up with a love for sports and realized early on how it could foster a sense of community on the res. Being passionate about education, she decided to attend the University of Tennessee, the University of Central Florida, where she was lucky enough to study under Dr. Richard Lapchick, Dr. William Sutton, and Dr. Keith Harrison, who further instilled the power of sport for social good. Her professional experience expands across marketing and media, having worked for some of the biggest brands, including Nike, or Nike, however you choose to pronounce it, Coca-Cola, and P&G. She is currently the host of the Creative Native podcast and on a creative endeavor to promote and serve the Native American community with creative stories, strategies, and solutions. Her podcast celebrates the coolest Native American athletes from all over Indian country. I can't thank you all enough for joining me today. I don't know how I got this chair gig, but it is pretty incredible for me to be with all of you. Welcome to the panel, everybody.
Thanks, Pam. So great.
Hi, Pam.
That's awesome. Well,
Nice
thanks for coming. You know, we've done this brief introduction. I know you all do so much more amazing work, but let's just start out with a little introductory question. Maybe we'll start with you, Ryan. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you got into podcasting. Like, what about the podcast platform appeals to you? And maybe talk about some of the podcasts that you work on.
Yeah, it's nice to be here with familiar faces, some of the people that I really respect in this space, who work hard to self-publish and to bring these voices out to the people. So it's nice to share this time with you. I started podcasting before podcasting was cool. And in fact, the Apple podcast directory was barely a thing. I bought a laptop to go to law school back in 2008 at the University of Manitoba, and I stumbled across GarageBand on a crappy old MacBook, and from there I found the little purple button that was shaped like a head that allegedly represents podcasting for some reason. And I hit it, and then I saw the audio meter start to jump inside the program, and I was like, what the hell is that? And then I noticed it was recording me, and the rest is history. And so for me, as a comedian and as a writer back when I was starting, self-publishing was a chance for me to get a jump on really sharpening my tools and getting a chance to say the things I wanted to say the way I wanted to say them. And back at that time, there just wasn't a lot happening for us. We're living in a time now where there are more opportunities for Indigenous creatives to work on film and television, theater, comedy, and to make money, to have jobs, to have a career. Back then, not so much. We were still kind of hung over from the Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans phase of our popular culture. And so, I was an actor that didn't look like Adam Beach. And so I wasn't very castable, and I had to find a way to make creative work, and podcasting was it. And really, that's how I got started all those years ago.
That's incredible. What about you, Phelan? I mean, how did you get into podcasting, and what about it really appeals to you?
Well, I was an actor who didn't look like Tina Keeper, no. But that's kind of it. Like, that's kind of it. It's really like, I went to school for theater. I studied theater. I went to be an actor, got out of school, and then promptly went to go work in retail. Did a bunch of, jobs that had nothing to do with storytelling really. But then I started doing a bit of writing. I started working with theater companies, but I knew as an actor, I was never really going to make it, because at that time, the perception of what we looked like and the diversity of what we look like was not really out there. And so I knew I wanted to tell stories though. And so theater was an entry point for me. So I started writing plays and they started to, get produced, and I had some success with that. And that was great. And then one day I was in a coffee shop with my friend, Leah Simone Bowen, and she said, we should start a podcast. And I was like, okay. Because I was really poor at the time. Those were my ramen years, as I call them. I wasn't making any money. And I was just saying yes to things that I was interested in or scared me. Because I think that if you travel down those avenues, that's where you're going to find the things, the work that you're probably supposed to be doing, the work that'll challenge you. And so we started a podcast. We had no idea what we were doing, no training. We hadn't gone to journalism school. We hadn't even gone to law school or attempted to go to law school. We had no idea what we were doing. We were not lucky enough to fall into a producer who knew the technical side of things. We had the storytelling side of things, but we didn't have the technical side. And so we self-produced the first couple of seasons, and then CBC approached us, and we were the first podcast acquired by the CBC. So in a lot of ways, we feel like we snuck in the back door. We, no, and then we wandered around and we had no idea what was going on ever. And then slowly we've just been insidiously making our way into different avenues in the CBC wherever we can. But I think that, because I know that this is a growing field. Podcasting is it's exploding and it's so awesome. And it's such, the technology is now becoming more and more user-friendly. It's open to everyone. If you have an internet connection, which I know not everybody does, or a smartphone, but there's better access to getting our stories out there. And so for me, whenever I meet someone who's a young storyteller, no matter, or an emerging storyteller, whatever that means, I tell them to pursue it, because it seems like, the tools are there to get our words and our stories out there. And so I think anyone can come to it in an unconventional way, because I feel like the way that I came to it was pretty unconventional.
Well, I love it. Ryan found a button. You just happened into it. What about you, Natalie? Did you see the wave of the future of podcasting? How did you get into it?
I'd like to think that I was like an early adopter, but I just have to say again that I'm just so honored to be here, and it's so cool to see people that I'm used to having in my ears. So it's really nice, and thank you for this space. But yeah, I have really distinct memories. I was actually working at an advertising agency at the time, and I have really distinct memories of like going on my lunch break and like keeping on my lunch break, because I was listening to this new podcast called Serial. It was like this whole new, it was like the kind of the thing at the time. It was like kind of one of the big groundbreaking pieces of podcast media. And so, and it just really opened my eyes. I'm like, wow, this story, like you don't have to have, I was doing a lot of production work and I was like, well, you don't always have to have the video, you know, you can just have the audio. And so I had cobbled together, you know, some minimal production skills at the time, and just thought, you know, like, man, I have stories I want to tell. So, and I was always too really interested in, I loved interviewing and talking to people and like just having conversations. And so that was another big piece for me, was like, okay, I can use this platform to have conversations and, you know, just have this and put it out into the world. And I feel like that's some of my favorite podcasts, is when I just get to like kind of just feel like you're with friends and you're getting to be a part of their conversation. And so that was when I kind of started. It ebbed and flowed throughout, because I actually went back to school, and then now I've switched professions entirely, and I am a professor. And I actually just started doing a freshman writing class, and they basically told us like, do what you want with it. And so I made mine about sports, and one of their assignments they just had was to do a podcast script and to think about, you know, how would you tell a story over audio podcast. So it's been cool to see just the rapid growth, and kind of like Ryan and Falen mentioned too, just these spaces for more Indigenous peoples to get involved in, you know, things like social media that kind of have connected us, has been really great to see. And like, I mean, I think I've seen like 3 new Indigenous podcasts come up just this week. So it's super exciting, and it's just not enough time, like not enough walks and not enough commute time to listen to.
That's awesome. And honestly, there seems to be a trend here. It's really just, you know, there wasn't space for us a long time ago in all of these entertainment industries, and podcasts are like, hey, maybe I can try this. Maybe I can have a conversation, and I can make it 15 minutes or 50 minutes or 5 hours. I can make it a serial. I can talk about whatever I want. I can talk about UFOs if I want to. I mean, there's literally no limit. And all of you have embraced that in such amazing ways that are like having a conversation at home on the res with your family. Or it's also like educational and entertaining. That's what I love about it. You can just make it whatever. Or you can just become a dynasty like Ryan McMahon. Ryan McMahon, why are you doing 8 billion podcasts? How did you get into the network or the industry of it? I mean, to go from like, oh, look, I found a button and I can record myself, to, hey, let's just produce a whole bunch of podcasts.
Yeah, well, Indian and Cowboy was basically a response to the podcasting space as it started to become an industry. And I had already had a successful podcast. Red Man Laughing was adapted into a national comedy special with the CBC. And as my platform grew as a result of that, and I was touring the podcast live, I thought, well, first of all, I think Indigenous people are the most innovative people on the planet. We've had to be. It's how we're still here. We come up with solutions very quickly. We're willing to experiment. We're willing to fail because we know our community has our back. And so for me, I was touring my podcast long before any of these dorky comedy podcasts that sell out massive theaters nowadays were doing it. I was touring my podcast in 2009 and 10 and 11. And just because I knew that the podcast could be an extension of my work, but maybe more importantly, it could make space. And Pam, you were on my podcast very early during Idle No More in 2012, and it was a result of chiefs storming Parliament, where we noticed that the mainstream media was failing. And so I just turned on a live stream service and turned over my podcast feed over to the community. And that for me was the beginning of the idea that we needed more producers out there. We needed more people in the space to grow the space, because the need was right in front of us. And so Indian and Cowboy came as a result of as a response to the fact that the space was dynamic, the barrier to entry was relatively low, and there weren't enough of us out there. And as I started to mentor and teach and train people in this space, I noticed that the interest was there, and that people really loved sitting and telling stories. And I've not reached my goals yet with Indian and Cowboy. I've not reached my goals in the podcasting space, and I don't think Indigenous creatives should be comfortable with where we are right now. We have so much potential in this space. And the one example I'll use is like language teaching, language retention, and language sharing. Most Indigenous communities I've ever traveled to, and I've traveled to hundreds of them, most of them have some form of radio going on in their community. There's always a radio on in the kitchen. We should be producing podcasts in Indigenous communities to teach our languages and putting that podcast over the radio waves. And, through Indian and Cowboy, we've trained many, I think close to, I've lost count, I think close to 43 or 44 communities on how to podcast in an effort to create language podcasts for their community. And we're just going to keep doing that. Like on our publishing side, we're quiet right now because we've put more into apprenticeships, more into hosting workshops than we've been actually producing podcasts. But we are recentering our efforts back onto publishing now that there is this large influx of Indigenous creators out there, and we want to do more to support them. So it was just a response. It was just a response to the need. I was at a giant podcast festival in New York City. I won't name the festival. But I was like, you're doing a BIPOC panel on podcasters and there aren't Indigenous people here. You don't even know whose territory you're on. This is a diversity panel with no Indigenous representation. And so I just started telling everybody, Indian and Cowboy is an Indigenous network for Indigenous people. We're not the only ones. There are many other people out there doing this, but it made me angry. So as you know, I have a bad attitude and a do it myself kind of mentality. And that's what Indian and Cowboy is. That's
so awesome, because of course it's all your work that made me wonder, hey, I wonder if I can find the button and find a podcast. Ryan's doing it and he's doing amazing. And what a way to lift up voices. I mean, it's just, and what you said really struck me, it's like res radio. So any of us who have ever been to a res, lived on a res, you listen to the radio, and sometimes, the radio host is up there just talking about the birds and the weather for like 2 hours. And you're thinking, it's interesting and it's funny. And they have all these little picadillos. And it's like, wait a second, podcasting could just be res radio for us.
I'm glad you went with birds and the weather and not birds and the bees, because I've heard that on res radio too.
I stopped myself. I was like, okay, I can't divulge all of our secrets. But here's the really cool thing, to follow up to that. A lot of Native podcasts are now being hosted on res radio for that very reason, because we're having these conversations. Now, Natalie, the last episode I listened of yours, you open up with, we get to talk to this really cool baller, she's really awesome. And here's the thing she's doing. And like in the first 10 seconds, I'm already inspired, because I know you're going to be talking to a really awesome person that's in sports industry. You always focus on Indian country. What made you focus on all of these inspiring, amazing people?
Yeah, it was just kind of a way, it was kind of just an excuse for me to kind of fangirl and be like, hey, come on my podcast. And it's funny to think of it that way, but it does kind of open a door and an outlet for you to, instead of just maybe being kind of creepy and just being like, hey, I just want to know you, but like, hey, come on my podcast. And one of the things Ryan made me think about too is like, and I still don't really know what the kind of the metrics are on my podcast. Like, it's not like, so most of social media where it's immediately like you have 500 likes or something like that. But what has really inspired me is just having people randomly kind of be like, oh, I love your podcast, or people that I know really well, who I would think didn't listen at all. And they're like, they'll come and have good feedback. And then most of the time people recommend someone else to have on the podcast. And so it snowballs into this like kind of community. And oftentimes too, I'm a big proponent of repeating guests too, and having them back to kind of update what's been happening. And it's really just kind of an outlet for me to kind of fangirl out and get to have these conversations with folks who I look up to. And for me, sport has been such a a life changer in my life, and it goes way beyond everything that happens on the field. It's more of what's off the field and the impact you can have in your community, and the impact you can have, especially in Indigenous communities, because there is such a passion. We all know res ball and all these things, and so it's a way, and it's a vehicle for so many people to get an education or to just better themselves all around. So I love looking at it from that lens, and looking at people are just honestly people that I look up to, and think that other people would love to hear from.
And think of the space you're filling. I mean, in history, our history is full of hardcore kick butt Native athletes who did well in every sport and Olympics and everything else, and they were never given their due. They were never celebrated in their time. And here we are now. You are literally celebrating these people and showing our kids, look at all these inspiring people that we have to look up to and learn from and share our stories. I mean, it's a real incredible thing that you do. And I think, obviously long overdue, especially in sports, because we have such amazing people in sports. And then Phelan, how on earth did you come up with this secret life of Canada? I can only imagine, because there is like the Canada that everyone thinks there is, and then there's the secret life of Canada. What was your inspiration for that?
Yeah, and the other thing is I had to always trip over, like, because I don't call myself Canadian, so that was like a whole other thing within it. But it just, like, the title encapsulated something about what we were trying to do. And so Leah Simone Bowen, my podcast partner and co-creator of Secret Life of Canada, in that conversation in that coffee shop where we were talking about starting a podcast, we both, as playwrights, leaned toward historical information. A lot of the work that I did as a playwright looked at, our people, the people who came before, those stories that weren't heard. And Leah, being a Black Canadian, she had those stories too. And we had all those traumatizing memories that I think a lot of maybe non-settler people do, non-white people in Canada, about history class or about class in general, where you are confronted with racism and the teacher's telling you something about who you are and your history, and you feel really like, well, that's the teacher, so the teacher's supposed to be right about this, so I must be wrong. And I just thought, this was a way that we could offer an alternative perspective. We could offer some real facts to people, and challenge. And also, not only that, but offer a resource to teachers. We didn't really start out thinking that it would be that, but teachers started using it. So then we had to stop swearing. I'd sort of, change our tone slightly in parts, but we knew that, there was an opportunity for us to address some of the things that we had come up against when we were kids in school. I tell the story all the time, but one of my early memories of being in a history class in grade 5 was my substitute teacher standing at the front of the class saying, when the white man came to Canada, Indians ran around naked. And I remember sitting there going like, is this? And looking, because there were other Native kids in my class, because this was in Brantford. So there's like other Native kids there. And I remember being like, is this true? I'm like, have you heard about this? And I went home and I talked to my dad, and my dad was like, no, that's not true. But he didn't do anything about it, right? So I think where we continue to progress into these places where people are willing to listen to us a little bit more. And so that's why I'm always like, if you've got a story to tell now, tell the story now. Because we've got this space right now, and we have this medium that really allows us to offer these things that people kind of want to hear, the stories that people are willing to listen to, which surprises me a lot sometimes. We did an episode on Ipperwash, and there was somebody who wrote to us on social media, and he said, I had no idea. I grew up when this standoff was going on, and I had no idea about the back history of it, that it went back, to World War II, that this is the history of, this is the seeds. We see the flashpoint in the media and the newspapers of the thing that happens and the thing that explodes and the standoff at Oka and face to face, but we don't ever look at what happened before. And so for us, we were like, let's take a look at all of those moments that led to this thing that everybody thinks is the thing that we're talking about, because this isn't the thing. the thing starts way back there. And when you give people the context for that in a way that isn't, I don't know, that is mixed with Britney Spears, you know, because that's the thing we try to do, is balance like some humor and lightness in it so that people don't shut down. And also we're not re-traumatizing the people who lived through those experiences.
Mhm.
So it's a delicate balance, but, you know, I think at least giving people the information so they can, if they decide to be racists after that, then, you know, then they're well-informed racists.
Yeah. They don't really have many excuses after that. And
Yeah.
the other thing is that it's like the educational part of podcasts. Podcasts can be entertaining. I mean, a lot of people tune into podcasts because they want to turn off, you know, something else, but it can be educational at the same time. And I think what you're doing is filling this major gap of Indigenous voices telling our stories based on facts, not propaganda, not whitewashed, and that pun is actually intended, but really it's from our voices. And I guess I'd really love to hear from all of you, you know, how important you think it is that we continue to fill these spaces. I mean, it was, you know, the art and entertainment industry, and then it became YouTube, and then social media, and now it's podcasting, and who knows what metaverse other thing we're going to be doing in the future. But how important is it that you think that we encourage other people to get in here, that you don't have to be rich and famous to be a podcaster, but it's our voices that matter the most? What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that getting into this space is important. I encourage people to do so with a bit of a plan, though. You know, full. I'm going to uncle you up a little bit here and just tell you that everyone's excited to podcast until it's time to podcast, and recording a podcast takes time. Editing a podcast takes time. Publishing a podcast takes time, and then distributing it, getting it out into the world takes time. And so, I think last year I read a report that said close to 80% of all podcasts on Apple Podcasts have 4 or fewer episodes because people get tired and they quit. And so I think it's really important to have a bit of a plan, set some really, really achievable goals, and be happy with the process of making a podcast and not necessarily the product. The first thing you make is probably not going to be that great. I thought my first season of Red Man Laughing was groundbreaking and hilarious and amazing. I would pay $1 million to scrub that thing off the internet because it's not that great. So set your goals, you know, and understand that the process needs to be as enjoyable as the product. And I think, process over product for me is the way I work in all creative endeavors. Enjoy the process of finding people to talk to, enjoy that conversation, enjoy revisiting it in the edit, and enjoy people listening to it. My first season of my podcast, you know, I was getting 11 downloads. I was getting 25 downloads. And I was like, holy shit, I think my mom listened to this 11 times. This is, thanks, Mom, you know. And then I go to something like Thunder Bay, which is now in the millions of downloads. And so, like, you know, I was just as happy with the 11 downloads as I am with the millions. And really, it is just about enjoying the act of making, the way it empowers your voice and your community, and ultimately the way you get to determine the story you want to tell. We become the story we tell ourselves. And Indian and Cowboy, the name of the company, is a tip of the hat to that, right? Cowboys and Indians told the world who we are for 100 years. Hollywood was built on the backs of dead Indians. And, you know, by reclaiming that, we are now telling the world who we are. And so enjoy that, because that's really, at the end of the day, what it's about. If you can scale and advertisers want to start looking at you, and you have a good podcast idea and you pitch to someone like CBC or someone else and they want to pick it up and help you make it, that's great. But that doesn't have to be your goal. That is not the only way to podcast. So have a bit of a plan, make your goals very achievable and enjoy that process.
That's really good advice. And what about you, Natalie? What kind of advice do you have for, Indigenous peoples or anybody who's listening and they're like, oh, that just sounds like so much fun. I want to be on Res Radio podcasting too. What kind of advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I think too, kind of going off so many of Ryan's good points of like not being afraid to fail. And like, I think I see it a lot in young people is like they want everything to be perfect on the first time. And so like do some kind of, some demoing, do some kind of practice runs and, play around with it and don't think that the first thing you do has to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the final product, and really play around with that space and don't be afraid to ask for help. I think a lot of people are happy to help out and give advice and even just collaborate too. I know several friends who have had the interest and they just didn't quite have and having a partner, someone to keep you accountable, I think is really, really helpful. I don't have that. And that's why I always joke that my podcast kind of runs on Indian time, because like I'll have like 3 episodes in a month and then I won't have any for like a half, 6 months or whatever. So I think having someone to kind of keep you accountable and like Ryan said, like having a plan and like a schedule. And I think that's kind of really, really a great way to go about it. But asking for help and also just not being afraid to fail and give it a shot for sure. Because there's always a new day to do another podcast.
Yeah, and everyone has to start somewhere. Oh my goodness, I feel like Ryan and my first couple of podcasts is like, ooh, cringy, but I just left it there. I figure other people will look at it and go, oh, she does that, I can do my own podcast. So what about you, Phelan? I mean, you have done the partnership thing. You've gone with this idea. It's now, and you approach CBC. I mean, what kind of advice do you have for aspiring podcasters who might want to take that particular route?
I wish I could offer better advice for this, because that's like one of the number one questions I get asked is like, how do I pitch? Like, how do I pitch to CBC? And I'm like, I have no idea, because we snuck in. I do feel like we snuck in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, they expressed some interest in us, but we had no idea what the hell we were doing, really. And so by the time that we had to go back to them, because it was kind of like that thing where like, kind of felt like high school where I think they asked us out on a date, but we misread the cues. And then like a couple of months later, we're like, wait a minute, was that what I think it was? And then we had to negotiate. And then we were in a place where we knew that, we could talk to them and that they seemed willing to go with us on on what we wanted to do. And they really had being an acquisition, I think was really lucky for us, because we got to maintain the way that we worked. We were a unit when we went in, and we played by our own rules. Like, we did the thing that we wanted to do the way that we had been doing it, because that's the way that we had been making the thing, which was really, really fortunate. I think like advice that I think of for pitching is just, if you're going to pitch to something like a place like CBC, or maybe, in the States, like you're going Gimlet or you're going big time, I think you have to have your tape ready. An idea is great, but have some tape ready to demonstrate that you can do it. Have an outline of what you think that season's going to be. If you can have like 3 episodes, maybe a lot, depending on what you're making. Have a couple of episodes in the bag to demonstrate that that you can do it. You can pull off the product. The rest of the season or series or whatever it is sketched out, who you're going to talk to, what the talking points are, what the sound design is going to be like. You got to think about your logo art. You got to think about your social media presence. You got to think about how often you want to be on social media doing those things, because that stuff is not fun. Thank God for Leah, who does most of the social media, because I can't. So there's a lot of things that you have to think about, right? If you're going to be putting together a pitch package. But the thing that I don't know, my advice aside from that is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Because that perfection that Natalie was talking about, I think can be a big deterrent for a lot of us, right? But I think you learn so much from making mistakes. And I do think, I think that I have found thus far that the Indigenous podcasting community is incredibly generous and supportive, and we're always willing to talk to each other and support each other's work and listen to things. And I think that if you get to a place where your work starts to, gain traction and be listened to, and you have an audience, I always think that there is a responsibility for that mentorship piece, and for championing other people, and making sure that, that the field is growing. Because I cannot tell you, there's not enough of us yet. There is not enough of us yet. The number of things that I want to do that I have to turn down that break my heart. I'm just like bugging a bunch of people now, and I'm like sending emails to people, and I'm just making sure that I bring people into the fold, because we need more of us. So mentorship, which I know is a word that has been used a few times, but I feel like mentor. Oh, and don't read the comments if it's going to hurt your feelings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you don't have that is I do, because I'm mean to myself. Also, I came from theater, so I'm used to reading reviews about how Falen Johnson had a screechy performance. These things stay with you. But yeah, don't read the comments if you can't handle that heat, because that can really be hard if you don't have the skin for that.
Yeah, I really like the combination of all of this advice. It really sticks with me. Like, don't chase perfection. That's good, Phelan and Natalie. Don't be afraid to fail, or what you think is failure. And Ryan's like, you gotta love it. Just, if you are in love with the process, don't be doing it for someone else. My mistake was, as a lawyer, I thought, I'm going to watch every YouTube video on how to do podcasts. I'm going to read every statistic. I'm going to listen to every podcast that says how to make podcasts, what's the best timing, what's the best style, how to promote it. And I was so busy doing that my first couple of podcasts were really short and weird and felt magazine-y. And I was like, that's not what I want to do. I just want to talk to people. I want to talk to cool people doing cool things and have this, res conversation. And so once I started doing that, then it was like, oh, this is what I do, and I love it. And I stopped worrying about, well, it should only be 20 minutes, because what if someone wants to pick it up and then it can fit in with commercials? And then it's like, if I want to have an hour and a half conversation with a land defender, I'm doing that. Or an elder who has incredible stories to talk about that has nothing to do with the topic that we're even talking about. That's what makes me feel good. And clearly, if you're doing stuff that makes you feel good, there's going to be other people that like what you're doing, because people wanted alternatives to radio and TV. Nobody's looking for radio copy edit. They're looking for weird, quirky, different, that speaks to everybody. So I just love this advice that you have. And I know that one of the most common questions I get, and that's why I'm going to pose it to all of you before we head to audience questions, is people always want to know what you think was the most significant challenge for you as a podcaster, and what did you do to kind of overcome that challenge? And, Phelan, maybe we'll start with you this time.
I think not. I mean, at first it didn't bother me. I think it's interesting. Like when we first started working on the thing, I was like, I don't know how to do this, but that's, I've done lots of things that I don't know how to do, and just sort of gone for it. But I think once I got into the CBC, I was like, oh, I'm not a journalist. And like, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I don't belong here. And imposter syndrome, right? Like, I think that's the thing that comes up for a lot of Indigenous people, or a lot of people. And I think for me, the thing that I have, I think the thing that's helped me overcome it is just doing the work. You do the work, you talk to you find these stories, and you nerd out so hard on them, and the research takes you down these intense rabbit holes, and you find these stories that that people don't know, that aren't out in the world in the way that they should be. Like, I think of this guy I talked to we did a 2-part episode, because my episodes kept turning into 2-parters last season, because I just kept getting obsessed with things. And I talked to this guy named John Moses, and his dad was Russ Moses, and he worked for Indian Affairs, and during Expo 67 he worked at the Indian Pavilion. And while he was working at the Indian Pavilion, he broke the rules, and he planted a plot of corn. And Expo 67, right, everything is very regimented, and the landscaping is contracted out to a specific company. And his active resistance, even though he worked for Indian Affairs, right, all those complications, he planted this plot of corn. and he handed out the corn to all of the hostesses at the Indian Pavilion, but also to members of Indian Affairs. And to me, I was like, that story is just like, I'm like, that is too good. And we don't, and I'm like, those small stories, like those small grassroots acts of resistance that those people were doing, you know, it's different now. We have all got phones, right? We've all got phones, and our activism has completely changed. And I think highlighting those, I got obsessed with that last season. I was like stuck in the 60s, looking at those early activists when they finally got cameras, you know, when they finally got to be able to tell stories through those mediums, like just super exciting. So that's the thing that keeps me going, is like finding those stories and getting to talk to people who lived through those things. We think of those things as so far away, but you know, talking to like those elders are still there, and we get to put their voices on, we get to put their stories out into the world in a way that like we can't forget them, right? And I think that that's like one of the most exciting things about this medium, is getting voices from community and stories that many people wouldn't otherwise hear unless we keep them, and we're the ones who are in charge of them. It's not, you know, it's not being archived. It's not anthropologists. It's us connecting with our communities, our other community, and telling our stories and keeping our stories.
Our voice is so important. So Natalie, what about you? Is there anything that you found particularly challenging about podcasting? I mean, I know you already talked about the consistency part, like some months, oh, you got lots of episodes, other months, maybe not so much. How do you deal with some of those challenges?
Yeah, it's funny because I definitely, that's probably been the biggest one, just being consistent. And I think it's great just to have a support system that keeps asking you. Plus, when people are like, oh, when they introduce you, they're like, oh, she has a podcast too. And it's like, okay, crap, I need to like read up, you know, make sure I have an updated episode ready. And so really just keep it, because like, and you know, life happens and all of us are doing multiple things. And so it's hard sometimes to focus. But for me, it's just, you know, never closing the door on it, and knowing that like, hey, it's going to be there, and my audience is still going to be there. And, you know, I try to just stay positive, and I have to just repeat what Falen said. The imposter syndrome is super weird, like super imposing and super influential. And it's really hard to overcome that a lot of days in all the kind of spaces that we feel. But I think podcasting is a great space for that to be just I know for me, it's therapeutic to have these conversations and to do this work. And even the production piece, I find the minimal production and editing I find it to be very relaxing. And it's, you know, and it's just so cool to put a product together and, you know, go through all the steps to put it out into the world and see that success. So just learning to love the process too of it, and just really committing the time to it, like blocking out, for me, it's blocking it out on my schedule and making sure like I have time devoted to it. And just like you would with writing or with any other kind of task that you have, really booking the time out for it, I think is really important. Even though it's something you do on the side, making sure you book time for that for your sanity, I think it is really great. And yeah, just I think also continuing to just have conversations, do things like this where we're just having these ideas. Like I love something that I know our community has talked about, and Falen, you mentioned this too, is like talking to the elders in our communities and preserving their voices. Like what better way to do that than through podcasting? And I know my tribe in specific, I know they've done even like old school like tapes, but I'm like, now we can digitize all that, go back and digitize all that, and just create a whole library of stuff. And so just thinking about the different ways to capture that and preserve our history. And we're traditional oral storytellers, and now podcasting is just this great vehicle for us to capture that.
Again, more good advice in your calendar: work time, gym time, podcast time. Okay, that's how we're going to get it done. Okay, and in our last couple of minutes before we head to questions, Ryan, I don't even know if you can pick one challenge. I mean, you're just so involved in it all, but is there a particular challenge for you, and how do you address it?
Yeah, there are so many challenges. I feel like this needs to be a panel in and of itself, because you have decisions to make. And First and foremost, I want to say a bunch of things very quickly. If you're serious, take it seriously. You deserve to make money. You deserve to have sponsors. You deserve to feed yourself. You deserve to feed your producers, your editors. You can make this a business. If you want it to be and you're serious and you have an audience, take it seriously. You deserve that just as much as any straight white dude in New York City talking quietly into a microphone, being super interesting. You deserve to eat too, first and foremost. Second of all, audience. Who are you making this for? There's a disturbing trend, and it probably started with us that were first in this space, to expose and open up all of our traumas for the entire world to witness. And it's disturbing. We should all go to therapy rather than start a podcast. So if we're coming to start a podcast to talk about how bad our life is, I would encourage everyone to rethink that. It's a very difficult space to be in anyway. But when your content is heavy and your content is hard and it's trauma based but not trauma informed, we're just hurting ourselves and hurting each other. And so it's something that is very front of mind now for me starting new projects, is like, who is this for? If it's not for my community, why am I doing this? And so that's one thing I want to flag. I think that's a whole other panel as well. The thing I'll say that is really challenging for me, that I've had to put a lot of thought into, is how do I publish and why? And so to Natalie's point about a publishing schedule, you know, I have a sizable audience on Red Man Laughing. I have tens of thousands of listeners when I'm publishing, but I can't commit to sponsors and I can't commit to Acast or Supercast or any other platform that wants to help me monetize and grow, because like everyone else in this panel, we're all doing other things to live and to feed ourselves. And podcasting is not my full-time job yet. And so it's really hard to find the space and to carve out the space to really take this medium seriously. And that's what I think a lot of podcasters that are serious about the space actually want. And there are very few answers. And there are very few networks out there taking risks on Indigenous stories themselves. I know that there are a couple, and these are very important experiments that we need to get behind and support. I'm thinking of like Connie Walker, Rebecca Nagel, and others that are working with mainstream podcasting companies in the United States to show that, yes, there are audiences, there is a thirst and a want and a need for these stories, and they're good stories. Above all else, they're good stories. They're fascinating stories and important stories. So the monetization, the publishing schedule for me is easily the most challenging piece. It's the one I struggle with the most. It's the reason why my own podcast feed has been dead for a while. Because I'm still trying to figure it out. I don't want to sign with sponsors and other people and then not be able to deliver on a deal. So I think the next thing I do is going to be a comedy storytelling podcast called Best Fucking Story Ever, which is just me talking to someone and they tell me their best fucking story ever. It will not be about our trauma unless the story's traumatic. It won't exploit or weaken our people. It'll be a celebration of our lives. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
That's the best fucking idea for a podcast. Oh my gosh, that's so awesome. Thank you all so much. That is such great advice. And for me, because I'm literally learning from all of you, the very first people I was watching was Rick Harp on Media Indigena and Ryan McMahon. And I'm like, how do I do what they're doing in my own way? And now I listen to the other two and so many others. So thank you. And I think now we're going to be joined by some Acast members who might have some other questions from the audience for us. Are you joining us? Oh, there we go. Yes. Hi, Tess.
Hi. The chat is blowing up. Everyone is absolutely loving all of this conversation. Pam and Ryan, looks like Lorimer is going to be reaching out to you for some guesting opportunities. So look at us. Aclass is here. Making connections and amplifying voices left and right. So right off to a great start. Our first question is for the group. It comes from Marco, an ally from Canada, who'd like to know what a non-Indigenous podcaster can do to support Indigenous podcasts. I'll let anyone who wants to take that one first go for it.
I think I saw the name Marco Timpano, which is a throwback to my early days in Toronto around Second City in the comedy space. And if that's funny Marco Timpano, hello, Marco. It's been, I don't know, like 15 years. It's nice to see your name. Oh, Marco, it is you. Good. Awesome. You know what I love? It's very simple. And I think it can happen more and more is pod swapping. Put a 1 minute long a trailer or some little 3 to 5 minute little taste of an Indigenous show at the front of yours, in the middle of yours, or at the end of yours. Use them as you would ads, and just help grow shows. I've done it for other shows, and other shows have done it for us. It was actually one of the ways that the Thunder Bay podcast in its first season really found an audience in the United States, is we started doing little swaps with other shows and mentioning those shows at the front and at the end of episodes. So I think that's a really cheap, easy, and fun way to build community, to build solidarity, and to amplify shows that you love.
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, that's a great one. It's hard to top that, but I would just say to give feedback, give us, download the pod, even if I tell this, I'm like, to tell all my friends, I'm like, even if you don't listen to it, just download it. And like, that helps. But obviously you listen, but also, just share and give us feedback. Like, I think I really always encourage feedback, and it's so rewarding when you hear encouragement, or even someone that, just had an idea based off something they heard from you.
I think my suggestion is the very basic, like, subscribe, comment, rate, share on social media, and then, and tell people about it by word of mouth. Because that's where I get the majority of my podcast recommendations, is from people I know who listen to podcasts.
Awesome. On that note, since you are kind of touching on growth and scaling up a bit with these answers, an anonymous attendee would like to know any creative ways that you haven't mentioned thus far about how to promote your podcast to build a following and get your voices out there.
Yeah, that one's tough, because my mind went to immediately social media, but that's not super creative. I mean, that's, I think, the go-to for this. But I really also I rely on my guests and their to spread it on their networks, and like I think we sometimes underutilize that when we have guests on a podcast and have them really promote to they may have a whole different audience as well. And I'm big with Phelan too, with word of mouth, just like getting people to talk about, because if you find a podcast you like you want to talk about it with other people. And so I think that's one of the most effective ways.
I think consistency in publishing is your best friend. And if you're not consistently publishing, it doesn't matter who's talking about your podcast, because they're not going to listen to it if you're not publishing. So consistency in publishing, I think, is the most important way to grow your show. In terms of being community minded, being on other podcasts is probably another very good way. If you can find a way to guest on a handful of podcasts that are in a similar space to yours, or even in a completely different space, but you find some common ground to sort of meet at, I think that's another really good way. And again, not all podcasts are looking for guest solicitations, but some are. And I don't know, it's Wayne Gretzky or some other dumb hockey player that said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, or whatever. Take some shots and be, again, I think we've heard it here time and time again, experiment, fail, and just keep at it. But publishing is for sure your best way to grow your show.
It would not be a panel with some Canadians without a mention of hockey. I mean, moving on to our next question, Andrew would like to know if you believe that you should maybe wait to book or to bank some episodes before promoting, since we've talked a little bit about, some of our cringy early episodes, or just, get out there and start promoting straight out of the gate.
I think it can go either way, right? Like if you are hyper focused on, it's kind of like writing anything. If you work on your beginning forever, you'll never get to the end. And so as much as I'm like, yeah, have some tape, I think have your episodes banked, but don't just hyper focus on that first one, because then you'll never get to your end and your end will be weak. So I think like that's my advice is have a good idea of where you want to go, have it plotted out, have a good idea of what you want to do. Because otherwise, like if you sit on those first couple of episodes though, and the process changes, right? No matter what you do, that first episode is going to sound away because you won't have found your footing yet. By the time you get to 3, 4, 5, like it'll start to evolve and it will change. And I think that that's okay, because podcasting feels like a very organic form, right? We get to travel with you. We get to grow with you as the listener. So I'd say know where you're going, but don't spend too much time on the top half.
I think make a bunch before you even publish and throw them in the garbage. It's a craft. This is craft. And if you want to get good at editing, you have to edit. If you want to get good on talking in a microphone, you have to talk into a microphone. And so for me, I'm big on craft. I know in the days of like remix culture on TikTok and everything else, it's like the buttons and the AI do everything for us. But in this, and shout out to Pam Palmater's TikTok, by the way, first and foremost. We haven't even talked about Pam yet, because Pam deserves a lot of credit for the work you're doing too in the space, Pam. It's very inspiring. I don't know how you find the time. You're talking about our time. You put more work into it than anyone, so congrats on that. But it's craft, right? And so find a way to make a bunch of work and throw it out and just keep making. If you walk around in your morning walk with a recorder and just go record the water, the birds, the trees, the wind, talk into it, go home, cut something that's 2 minutes long, throw it in the garbage and keep at it. And by the time it comes time to publish, you'll feel confident about your work.
We are running out of time. I know that we haven't answered every one of the questions that have come through. Bernard, I see you. You are on our list. We will follow up with answers to all of your questions. We've got some from some anonymous attendees as well. And Derek, I can call you out right away because I know that your question is about best platforms to launch on, and I may be biased as an Acast employee, but stay tuned. We'll be talking about some codes and deals. It's not the only place to host, but it is a wonderful place. So I will turn it back over to Pam now and take it home.
Thanks, Tess. And that's a wrap, folks. I mean, time really flies when you're engaged in good combos with awesome people. And I'm with Ryan. Let's have more of these and have longer sessions on all of these topics, because I think it's good just for all of us to learn from one another. And thanks for the good words, Ryan. And thank you to Ryan, Phelan, and Natalie for all of your insights and experiences. I'm sure everybody learned a lot. I was reading the chats and the comments, and everyone was just loving what you were saying. And don't forget to check out Acast's other Aclass events, because they have been featuring Black voices, Latinx voices, queer voices, all the groups that we work with in solidarity. So help support them. And they put together a special promo code for anyone who wants to have a home for their new and aspiring podcast. And the code is Aclass, capital ACLASS, for 6 months of free hosting for any of the plans that you choose to sign up for. Thank you, everyone. Walalan. I've just enjoyed this so much. And thank you to all of the audience. We're going to sign out now, because stay tuned for panel number 2 with Nick Estes. That's going to be a good conversation. See you, everybody.
What an amazing panel. So much energy, so much, I would say gems. We call them gems. So I'm excited to have our next panel and have our next guest here. We're going to be bringing him in here shortly. And it's we have Nick Estes joining us today. Really quick, if you don't know who he is, he's a citizen of the Lower Burlew Sioux tribe. He is the author of the award-winning book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. Estes is also the co-host of Red Nation Podcast and the lead editor of Red Media. His writings have been featured in The Guardian, The Intercept, Jacobin, Indian Country Today, High Country News, Globetrotter, NBC News, and elsewhere. Estes was the American Democracy Fellow at the Charles Warden Center for Studies in History at Harvard University. He is also a Lenin Literary Fellow and a Margaret Casey Foundation Freedom Fellow. And I will bring you in, Nick. How are you doing? Welcome to our second panel today on getting your podcast off the ground.
Thanks for having me, Vernon.
So I want to jump in a time machine and go back to this is a special date for you in the podcast, October 13th, 2019. That was your first episode. What was going through your mind leading up to that? What was going on? What was the process of getting there?
Well, first of all, October 13th, 2019 was Indigenous Peoples Day. So we planned the release of the podcast kind of to coincide with that. But also we had been doing kind of, I guess, like a rough draft of the podcast where we were just publishing on SoundCloud. I, as a journalist, but as well as somebody who's involved in social movements, have the privilege of being in certain spaces with certain people. So I have access to this network, but also, as an academic, I also have access to some of the top thinkers in our field, whether it's Indigenous studies or history. And so I was recording these things. I was doing these things prior to publishing the podcast formally, on Apple Podcasts and the major kind of podcast distributors. But I hadn't really taken that step yet. And so it was nerve-wracking, but I partnered with a friend and colleague of mine, Sina Rahmani, from East is a Podcast. And he really showed me the ropes on how to, do the technical kind of aspect of it. But it was nerve-wracking because mostly I, as somebody who's done journalism and, research and interviews, I mostly sit behind the scenes and I don't really like to come forward on kind of like put my perspective on. But learning that process, I learned that it's not so much people want to hear what I have to say, so much as they want to hear the conversations that I'm having with people. And so that was kind of the most nervous thing for me, was just to be on air, to be unscripted. We try to make our podcasts unscripted and have them, organic conversations. So that was the biggest, I guess, like challenge for me, was to like out there as a host.
And what was the thing that allowed you to push through that? Was it like just doing it consistently, or was it something else?
Yeah, so I am a trained oral historian. So, and oral traditions are very kind of, unique to Indigenous communities. They're unique to every community in many ways. But I really like the conversations where you kind of break down the fourth wall or the third wall. I don't know what that's called, but it's more of like having an intimate kind of personal conversation with somebody and not really thinking so much about the audience, or pretending not to think about it, or doing it in such a way where it's people want to hear what your conversation is like, right? They don't want to hear, it's a kind of interview style. So it's like, they want to hear like what, because I have a lot of relationships with these people. So one of the people I interviewed were some organizers in Albuquerque that I for a long time. So they speak to me as a friend, they speak to me as somebody they know. And so really kind of breaking down that fourth wall and thinking less about pandering to the audience, even though you are pandering to the audience, there is kind of an entertainment aspect to it. But having that kind of conversation more intimate between two friends or two colleagues. And that way it's less, rigid, it's less scripted, it's more organic and free flowing. So those are the kind of like aspects of the interview style that I really appreciate, because I think of it as, when I trained as an oral historian and worked for an oral history center, I listened to a lot of interviews by scholars who, seemed very rigid. They didn't, there was kind of a tension between the person being interviewed and, the interviewer. And so I really think of the interviews that I do as more of like a coffee table discussion. And I often in person, obviously with the pandemic, that's not so easy. But that's kind of the style that I like, to have a more personal conversation that's intellectually rigorous, but also accessible to, to everyday people, because I have access to academics and to major thinkers. And instead of taking a class, or signing up or spending lots of money, they can listen to my podcast and hopefully gain access to that information in a way that's accessible.
Beautiful. And I can tell by listened to your interview with Rebecca Nagel, and I can tell that it was more of like it seemed like two friends kind of like sharing their, like you said, at a coffee table, kind of sharing their stories. And oh my gosh, can you believe this is so incredulous, things like that. So one of the things I was curious about, because your work with Red Nation and the activism that you do, how has the podcast been an extension of that, or how have you leveraged that or used it as a way to further your mission?
Sure. So the Red Nation really is the basis of the podcast itself. The intention behind it was to actually provide a platform to not only educate our membership, but also to educate our communities on issues, right? And so the way that it kind of works is, there'll be a subject that, some of our membership or some of the people in the community are interested in. And so we do an episode on it. And I don't think we would have been as popular as a podcast had we not been a movement before, right? And so I think that's what separates us from, folks who kind of go into, the mainstream kind of podcasting circles, and they're picked up by an institution, which is really great. But the difference, our approach to this is thinking that social movements themselves are legitimate sites of knowledge production and stories. And me as an intellectual, somebody who's not only just somebody who works in the academy, but is also intimately involved in these movements, I try to take the things that they say seriously, and the ideas that they produce seriously, and present them to a broader audience. And we are catering to Indigenous communities, and we are prioritizing Indigenous stories, but we don't pigeonhole ourselves. We extend our reach beyond what is categorically called, or considered Indigenous in the United States, and thinking about it as a global phenomenon. And we are having conversations with Black activists. We're having conversations in Latin America. We're having conversations in Spanish sometimes, so we don't really believe in kind of the parochialism of the United States or Canada. In fact, we want to provincialize Canada and the United States and really think about these stories reaching our communities from a global perspective. And I think that sort of changes the outlook a little bit, because we have a subscriber-based model. So we don't really have funders, big donors really kind of dictating the content or the whatever it is of the stories that we're producing, but the people who are dictating like what they want to hear are like $1 a month subscribers. Many of them are, as I've traveled around the country, I've met a lot of the Patreon subscribers that we have, and they're just everyday people. And it's actually how they stay informed. And they always tell us, they're like, I appreciate how you're not just so hyper localized in Canada and the United States, but you show how, these, struggles in Bolivia or struggles in Guatemala or wherever are similar to what we're going through in the United States, and even Indigenous media in Canada and the United States, because if it's publicly funded, it tends to just focus on Canada and the United States. I think that's such a disservice to how we actually think about ourselves, because we are global people. We're not, just some local culture that can only talk about certain issues. We are the mainstream. Like, we have to move beyond. The goal is not to remain on the margins. The goal is to take the center, right? On our own terms, of course.
Beautiful. So it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is that the movement was the foundation, and through the movement, through your work as an intellectual, and also being out in the community, you're able to broadly share these conversations, and people can see them holistically across multiple regions of the world. Is that correct?
Exactly. And even within the United States, we had Charisse Burton-Stelly on, who's an amazing Black Studies scholar and activist involved in the movement. And there's, these critical conversations that need to happen between and Indigenous communities in the United States, because first of all, Black and Indigenous, those aren't mutually exclusive terms, right?
Right.
But also, if we think about our histories as shared histories, it creates different conversations. And I just don't, maybe I don't listen to podcasts that are really doing that, but I don't see them happening the same way that they're happening on our stream. And that's what we prioritize, is to have more of a lateral conversation versus an up-down conversation, or one dictated by an institution, whether it's a university or a funder. We're dictating the terms of our conversations, but also, we're embedded and invested in these movements themselves. And so somebody like, Charisse Burton-Stelly, she has her own podcast. And so we kind of, cross-pollinate in terms of our listenership. So it's really good. It's a really good model.
Smart. So you're able to basically capture her audience and vice versa. She can bring people over from your, when from a listener response, what has the sentiment been as you've grown the podcast? What has your listenership, what are some of the things they have said they've appreciated about the work that you're doing with Red Nation?
Yeah, so when we started, just looking at the numbers, we had, I think our first episode maybe had like 1,000 listens, which is, I think, fairly good for a first episode. I was listening to the I was listening to the panel. I was listening to the panel before, and I really appreciate what they said, because I like going back, I'm like, I kind of cringe a little bit listening to the audio content, those kinds of things. So the comments have been anywhere from, the production quality has increased, because we've gotten more resources and we've gotten more experience to higher quality podcasts. I think what listeners, what I've gotten a good response from most listeners, like when I was out in the field, for example, at the Line 3 protest to stop the construction of the tar sands pipeline that was going through Anishinaabe and Dakota territories in northern Minnesota, many of the pipeline activists who were in the camps would come up to me. I mean, most people don't see my face. So there's this kind of funny response, but then they hear my name and they're like, "You're the podcast guy." And so, but it's cool to hear, because they're like, they tell me, they say, this is a podcast that I can share with my family. I can have my grandma listen to this podcast and she'll understand these issues, but it's also a podcast that you can listen to on the front lines of a pipeline protest, for example, because they're like, these issues speak to our reality as Indigenous people. But also, it's also important to note, while we target the Indigenous community as a listenership, the reality is, just because it's a numbers game, that the majority of our listeners are non-Indigenous people. And so we hear a lot from educators who teach it in the classroom. We've actually created reading and study guides for Indigenous literatures. We have a whole podcast series called Native Reads, where we focused on the Oceti-Sakowin literary tradition. Oceti-Sakowin is the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. And so we picked, we worked with the Oak Lake Writers Society, which is a tribal writers society, to essentially curate a reading list for educators, for primary education as well as post-secondary education. And we've gotten a lot of really great feedback on that, because we interviewed the authors if they're still alive, or we tried to interview some of their descendants to talk about the legacy of these amazing writers that should be taught, in the courses. And so just from that one nation alone, the Ochete Xalcoy, that we found that there are over 250 books that we've authored as a nation.
Wow.
And so we provided that bibliography. And so while we do kind of the more like, social movement, on the ground kind of stuff, we also think, more holistically, and thinking that not everyone, we have a diverse audience, and so not everyone's into certain episodes, and, some people are more into other episodes. And we try to be mindful of that. We try to have a healthy balance between sort of the hard hitting kind of political analysis and frontline stories, as well as offering, tools to educators who might not have access to resources. Frankly, in the state of South Dakota, they've cut Indian education. They've gutted the curriculums, with this larger push to get rid of critical race theory or whatever. And so educators are having a hard time finding resources. And so I think we provide an essential role in helping them, to have these resources to teach in their classrooms, and to show that there is this broad, diverse, and expansive world of Indigenous literatures, but also Indigenous voices.
Beautiful. Beautiful. You mentioned resources, like when the audience had come back to you, they said the resources that you've invested in have improved the content and what you're able to do with it. How do you access those resources as a creator, as an Indigenous creator? What are the challenges that, people may have to overcome when it comes to the resources? Because while podcasting is, as there's a low barrier to entry, right? You do have to purchase a microphone. You do have to have an internet connection. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on those things.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because oftentimes we've interviewed elders on the show. And of course, with like the pandemic, it's like a little bit difficult to, it's not a little bit difficult, it's very difficult, because the learning curve to access internet, and then to set up, we use Riverside FM to set up the account for Riverside FM to record audio or video, whatever we're doing. So what we tend to do is we try to make contact with a younger, relative of theirs who is more tech savvy. But we've also created like an instruction manual, so to speak, of like how to handle certain technical difficulties, how to set up, we do YouTube. We're not just solely audio anymore. We've expanded into that realm. And so, like I'm using an external webcam right now, an HD webcam. We tell folks, have the webcam eye level, teach them like the basics of the thirds, all that kind of stuff. So that's one thing that we've developed, and we've learned it through experience. And there's a lot of great resources online that you can do that. But I think most importantly is that our subscribers actually made possible the increased quality of our feed and of our content, because again, unlike other kind of podcasts that are attached to institutions or attached to major streams, ours is entirely independently run and 100% subscriber funded. And so the quality of our content is based on the subscriptions that we get, or the donations that we get to do this. And so it's really this kind of give and take with our audience, and really responding to the things that they need and that they want. And I honestly, I do regret, we haven't been able to meet all those technology needs or all the needs of our audience, because, for example, we need to move into transcriptions. We've been able to transcribe our videos, but our audio content, we haven't been able to fully move into that realm, just because it requires a different level of expertise. Not because like there are transcription services available. The issue is that we use a lot of Indigenous content, and so they might not know the language, they might not know the words that we're using, and so it takes a little bit extra level of curation. And we have transcribed some podcasts in the past. And it's not to say that we haven't done that, but those are kind of some of the things that we've gotten as feedback from the audience of meeting their needs.
So your direct relationship with the audience and their support for the show allows you to fund the show, and you reinvest that back into the content. And I think this is important because a lot of times you've heard, oh, you have to have big sponsors and
Right.
you have to have, X amount of listens. And I think what we've started to see over the last year within the industry is more of this relationship. The creators are basically understanding that the value of their audience and the value of having platforms where they can facilitate that exchange and value. And therefore they're able to, like Ryan was saying in the last panel, they're able to eat off their podcast, right? So I think that's very beautiful to hear. And it's inspirational for the people that are out there that are like, hey, what if I don't have 10 million bajillion listens? How do I make this work? And it's your proof of concept that it does work.
Yeah, and I think it's people should, if there's funding available, they should take it. Nobody should. It's just politically and ethically for our project, this is what we decided to do. It's like we will make or break ourselves on the donations and the resources that our listeners provide, right? And it's like the NPR model, we have to do fundraising every now and then, but I really appreciate it. And I think, in the world of chasing, there's a lot of money out there for, doing these kinds of things. But we don't chase grants, we don't chase funding, and we don't chase sponsors. What we do is we curate and communicate and dialogue with our subscribers, and we meet their needs first and foremost. And I think it's a good model in many ways. There are certain challenges to it because it did take us a while to get to this point where we are kind of self-sustaining. But it's this kind of give and take. And I had the privilege of having a different job. I don't get paid for this work. And I did it, to essentially help build the platform itself. And we do have people, we're able to, pay people for their labor, and we are able, and, I don't really like to ask people to volunteer. So we do, because they deserve it. They're experts in this field. And so
it's their time too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I want to kind of segue here and talk about, you've done a lot of work in activism in your communities. Do you feel like any pressure as an Indigenous creator to talk about certain things, given your background and the work that you've done on the podcast? Do you kind of feel like that weights on your shoulders, or is it, I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like the last panel kind of touched a little bit on this. I think there's this tendency, not just in the podcasting world, but I think in mainstream media in general, to really push us to share like these trauma stories. Sure. And it's something that, I think there's a time and place for it. But what I believe in, sort of creating a sense of optimism to highlight stories of people who are in struggle, or stories of like Native literatures that are empowering to our communities, also to show other communities in struggle and what we share in common with them. I also, as an Indigenous, and journalist, and writer and historian, I really hate getting pigeonholed as like, now we'll bring in the Indigenous voice on this, or now we'll create kind of the space for Indigenous voices. And I feel like that really waters down we call it the Indigenous. In the world of journalism, we call it the Indigenous quota, where it's like, there'll be something going on in mainstream politics, but we only have one Indigenous voice in the Washington Post, or we'll only have one Indigenous story in the New York Times, or whatever it is, or we'll only have one Indigenous commentator. And it really just like flattens out like who we are. Just in the United States alone, there are over 560 different Indigenous nations with distinct histories, with distinct languages, that we need a diversity of voices. But it also operates a scarcity mentality, as if there's only a certain, there's only can be enough room for Indigenous people and Indigenous voices, or that they can only talk about certain things that we consider Indigenous issues. And we operate on the abundance mentality, that we have an abundance of Indigenous creative potential. We have an abundance of knowledge. We have an abundance of stories. It's just that the mainstream media isn't ready for it. So why cry on the shoulder of the man who stole your land, as Arthur Manuel, the Secwepemc activist, once said? So why cry on the shoulder of people who categorically erase us from the mainstream? Why not build your own content? Why not build your own platform according to your own rules and what you find and your community find as relevant and pertinent information? And that's really how we operate as the Red Nation podcast, as well as the larger media project that we're working on called Red Media.
And to me, this is a critical, and forgive me, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm educated on a lot of the things that you've done and Native history in this country, because I know a lot of that stuff has been whitewashed and buried. But for me, it seems like this is a moment for Indigenous voices. It seems like there's a lot of things that are happening in the climate of at least from where I sit, that this is a moment for Indigenous voices and Indigenous people to almost kind of take back that the stories. And do you feel that that's the case, or am I kind of going down the path here? Or
it is to a degree. And I really appreciate the panel that was before this talk, before this discussion, because I think we should also flesh out the differences between Canada and the United States, because Canada has made a concerted effort to actually lift Indigenous voices, not without its own issues, and to sort of put Indigenous voices in the mainstream and to feature them. In the United States, it's just like hostile erasure. As somebody who's worked in journalism, like working with legacy media outlets is like, it's not even worth it most of the time, because you have to teach them from like square one. They have no basis of understanding of the principles or the basics of Indigenous issues or Indigenous history. And so why waste time, when the bar is so low that it's literally underground? And why not just create our own standards and our own quality? And I think that opens up, it makes it less stressful for me. I feel much more freedom on my own platform, talking to an audience that has been engaged with me, that has kind of seen me evolve, and the people that I've had on my podcast evolve over time, than trying to educate people who are living in the 19th century. And really what Indigenous media is doing in this moment in time is trying to drag the rest of this country kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And I know that there's similar issues with, with Black voices and Black media and other kind of marginalized groups. It's like, we really have to think about, this moment in time. And again, it goes back to that idea of scarcity. It's like, they're operating on a scarcity mentality, and we shouldn't confine ourselves just to what they think that we're capable of doing. We should operate on a mentality of abundance and really be generous with that, within reason, of course, with each other as content producers, etc. And I think that's really, what this podcast has created, or at least introduced me to, is this whole community of podcasters and content producers that are invested in raising each other up and providing and creating space for each other. Whereas the mainstream media, it's so backwards in many ways when it comes to Indigenous issues. I teach courses on this. We look at the New York Times. How many times, does the word Indigenous come up on on the front page? And how are Indigenous people talked about? There was this really great Native American Journalists Association report on the New York Times, and the racist depictions of Indigenous people that it has perpetuated, not like in the 19th century, but like within the last 6 years. And it's frequent association of Indigenous people with violence, and it's not just Indigenous people. So why would you want to work in that newsroom? You know, if this is the way that your colleagues are writing about you and demonizing you,
Sure.
and why not work in a more creative and collaborative community that understands these issues, right? And I think what we're seeing in this time is not just the elevation of Indigenous and Black voices, but we're also seeing the rise of alternative media sources that really reflect the generation and how they get their news sources, right, and how they get their information. And that also comes with a whole host of different responsibilities, which I can get into if you want to talk about.
So let's say that I, and a lot of these things I've experienced as a Black man in America, working in traditionally white spaces. Tech is traditionally a white space. And it's like, you see these things come up and you're like, how didn't somebody fact check that or think, so it's like, you go off on your own and you build something, right? Or hypothetically, let's say somebody's watching this and they're like, look, I see these struggles, I see the challenges, and I want to go off and build this thing. How do you do that ethically without repeating the same mistakes that the other people have made previously,
Yeah, and I think what we're living in this moment where, again, there's an abundance of new Indigenous podcasts, Black-run podcasts that are focused specifically on the kinds of things that we're concerned about, as content creators or as journalists or as writers. And so there, it takes a little bit of research. And what I've noticed is that there are kind of like little cliques in the podcast scene that this group of podcasts talks about these issues, right? And they tend to have each other on their shows, and then this group of podcasts talks about these issues. And that's really how I did a lot of research, on our show to kind of see, like, why do I like this? What is it about this show that appeals to me? Is it the way that they're presenting the information? Because I listen to news shows, which I don't find terribly interesting, but I really like the shows about where it was just two people like talking and sharing information, because it was easier for me, because that's how we get most of our information. We can read as much as we want, but it's really when you're out in the field talking to people, listening to their stories, listening to how they understand the world, right? And that's really where I kind of found my inspiration, by listening to these other podcasts and how they were presenting that. And for Indigenous folks, I think we do place value on that kind of oral tradition. So podcasting is literally just an extension of something we've been doing for thousands of years, and it makes sense, right? We've always been telling stories. We've always been sharing information this way. It's just a new medium and a new platform. And I don't quite think, as you were talking about, feeling these things in different spaces, I don't quite think that there is that space in some of these kind of legacy journalists or journalism, outlets. I just don't know if they're some of them, have done great work. I shouldn't, cast them all aside, but I think the real important kind of groundbreaking work is happening online and on these podcasts. Who would have thought that this kind of ragtag group from Albuquerque would have created the Red Nation podcast and gotten, over 1 million listeners, over the course of 2 years. Like, that's quite an achievement. And we started from nothing. Like, we didn't even have a budget for the first podcast that we had. It was just like, I had like an old, Zoom recorder that I was using, and I was just sticking the microphone in people's faces and having conversations. And that's how we started.
And I think that's for the people out there listening. I think a lot of times what we think is we see these legacy publications, we see a lot of these major studios, and we're like, oh, it has to look like that to start. Yeah. I have to have the soundboard and the lighting and the effects and the mix and the engineer. But it's like you're saying, you literally had a Zoom recorder and you went out and was like, hey, can you answer this question? Like, to me, that's inspiring. And that just shows that now is an opportunity that, it's wide open for people who want to step up to the plate and run with it.
Yeah. TikTok is a perfect example of how, like, you don't really need all of that content or all of that technology.
Sure.
It's important. Like, you should aim for quality content. You should like hold yourself to a high standard, but it shows you how like people are consuming media. It's like people are making this on their phones, like kids are making this on their phones, and they're reaching far more people than we are on our podcast. But it just shows that like the creative potential is already there. We have the tools at our disposal in many ways, but it really just takes, I think, I believe in the software, not so much the hardware. It's like what is actually programmed into the episode versus like all the bells and whistles, the sound clips, the gadgets that we have, are we like, what kind of mic are we using? Are we using a Shure mic? Are we in a studio? It's the software that I think is much more important in like, what is actually the content that's being, produced. Like I recorded, one of my favorite podcast episodes that I've recorded to date was with my friend Vivi Camacho, who works for the Ministry of Ancestral Knowledge in the plurinational state of Bolivia. And I was traveling to Bolivia, and I wanted to bring all my like fancy equipment, but it's like when you're traveling in those situations, it's like you have to be judicious about what you carry with you. And all I had was my iPhone, and I recorded her in a coffee shop. It actually turned out quite, it was kind of serendipitous. It turned out quite well because we had the kind of the street sounds of La Paz in the background, but the microphone on the iPhone is actually incredibly good. It records really good quality audio, and you can do voice isolation now on the new iPhones. And so it actually turned out really well. And I don't, most people may have thought I had some kind of, I don't know, master audio equipment with me, but it was really just my iPhone that I recorded it on. And it turned out, I think it turned out well. It was at least listenable to most of our subscribers.
Beautiful. Before we jump into, we're going to have a Q&A shortly. So if anybody's watching, by the way, just drop your questions in the chat. Tess will jump on here momentarily and answer those. But I wanted to shift gears a little bit and just ask you, maybe who are some of the creators that are inspiring you right now? What is some of the work that you're seeing out there, whether it be podcast, video, audio, that is, you feel like people should be kind of looking at, and maybe it's something that you're using to be inspired by?
Yeah, I really appreciated This Land podcast by Rebecca Nagel, who's a Cherokee journalist. I think she's like the most recurring guest that we've had on our show. But I feel like the way that she's done those two investigations on the McGirt decision, as well as the Indian Child Welfare Act, she kind of takes like what we might kind of assume as like a status quo thing that we may not pay attention to, and really kind of peels back the layers to show what the kind of the stakes of these issues in the legal realm are. I also, really appreciate a lot of the stuff that's coming out of, Canada. I've listened to a couple episodes of the Thunder Bay podcast, which I find really good. I think Ryan McMahon hosts that. And in terms of, other podcasts that I listen to, I really like Bad Faith podcast with Brian Newsom. A friend of mine, I was on the show. I really like that podcast because I think it's really kind of current with news and politics. I also listen to my friend's podcast, East is a Podcast, which is by my friend Sina Rahmani. He helps produce our podcast. He's given us a lot of kind of guidance on how to promote and how to really, get our work out there, but also really good ideas on podcast episodes. Like he gave us this idea, like he really pushed us to do a review of Dances with Wolves, which is, it was like offensive to watch, but also like people just want to know, they love that stuff. And so, our subscribers really wanted us to do an episode on that. I also listen to, there's some newsy podcasts that I listen to. I don't really want to get into those, but those are like some of like three that I can really point to, or four that I can really point to, that I really like. I'm always inspired by how they're conducting their interviews, and the kinds of, content that they're putting out on their feed.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I think we are getting close to, if not, are we there yet? Let's see. Tess, are you around? Are we doing Q&A? What's the status on that?
I'm here. Let's do it.
All right.
So Derek asks, how do you straddle the two? And I believe this was earlier in the chat. So Derek, chime in again in the chat if I mess this up, but I believe you were referring to academia and the movement back when we were talking about that.
So how do I straddle those two? I don't really see a separation, because I think, like, as somebody who's a trained historian, the place where we do research is the archives, right? We go to the National Archives, or we go wherever these papers or whatever we see as, like, the site of knowledge, where it's produced and where it's housed. And that's still important work, but the language we're using today, the issues that we're talking about today, also come from a certain kind of archive that is in constant motion and constant flux. And those are the social movements of our generation. And so I'm not really straddling the two. It's just a legitimate side of knowledge production, and it needs to be taken seriously. And so that's really where I might differ from some people. Some people might do that work. Some people might not do that work. That's just where I see myself. I guess where the difference is between the kind of like academic world and the world of social movements is that the academic world, there's an elitism that's tied to it. We have to publish in certain journals that are only accessible through paywalls and through some kind of privileged access to a library service, whereas the social movement world is like, the goal is to get your message out there in every kind of platform and every kind of medium as possible. And if you're a movement intellectual, you're not going to like just put everything behind a paywall. You're not going to just put everything that's behind something that makes it inaccessible, or use language or concepts or platforms that simply everyday people don't use. And so I always think about, I guess the best way to put it, and maybe this is a bad analogy, but Garth Brooks, right? He's super popular, right? We may not like his music, whatever, but then there's a bunch of indie bands out there, right, that do a lot of like really great music, but they tend to kind of stay on the margins, and they tend to play like basement shows, which is cool. There's a place for that. But the people who follow that scene tend to be very judgmental, especially when you break into the mainstream and become as popular as Garth Brooks. We don't want to be Garth Brooks, but we should strive to reach his level of popularity, and try to understand, why is it that this music, or why is it that this person speaks to such a large audience? And I think that should be our goal as intellectuals as well. Not everyone is into this. And, I'm not trying to say that everyone should do this, but it's just my kind of professional and career goal is to make the ideas, the wonderful ideas that, the Academy produces, as well as social movements produce, as accessible and mainstream as possible.
Amazing. Ooh, Ryan popping up in the chat. Ryan, would love to know, welcome back, by the way, can you talk about reciprocity and Indigenous community ethics when it comes to Indigenous podcasting, digital media, and storytelling, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So a lot of the interviews, or some of the interviews that we've done, I would call it privileged knowledge that's attached to a lot of this stuff. And you can't just put a microphone in somebody's face and, say like, give me the knowledge that you have. There's protocol involved. As somebody who does research beyond kind of the podcast realm, there are certain things that I will talk about publicly, and there's certain things that I don't, if it's privileged knowledge, then it doesn't need to, it doesn't need to be out there. And so we work with Indigenous communities and the people that we interview about how they want, what they want out there. And we do edit things out. We work with them in terms of like how they want this to be distributed. Sometimes they want to be, they want it to be published on, or to rebroadcast on their local radio station. And so we work with them on that to say, hey, they have this local tribal radio station. We want to curate this content for them. We'll give it to them for free. So we don't, our reciprocity model is basically all of our content is free. There's some stuff behind like that's based on a subscriber model, but if you just subscribe to our podcast, you're going to get all the audio for free. And we publish what we believe are kind of pertinent stories and information on our YouTube page. But I think what's also important, which we don't really kind of broadcast out there, is that the relationships that exist with the people we feature on our show that you don't really see on screen or on the feed itself. And that's something that I think as an Indigenous researcher, it takes kind of, it takes a lot of humility to kind of go through those processes, because you can't just ask somebody to share a story without letting them know, like how it's going to be used, right? So that's a question that we're always debating, because we don't do, there's certain shows that we haven't done because of the content that was involved or the information that was shared. And I guess like one of the rules that we've always kind of gone by is like, if it's never been published, like if this, spiritual or cultural knowledge has never been published, then we have to be really careful how we share it, because we don't want to exploit this community. And we're also not trying to make money off of it. We're, our model is an anti-profit model. If people want the content for free, if they want the unedited transcripts, whatever it is, we tend to give those back to the community themselves to use. And also like with the Native Reads podcast, I think that was the coolest podcast series we did, because we worked with a lot of elders and knowledge keepers on their stories of these historical figures. And we got lots of input because they were the ones who were doing the interviews. The elders were the ones who were doing the interviews of other elders. And I've never, I haven't really seen something like that on feeds yet. And it's not about me being on the feed and hosting everything. It's about lifting the voices of the people that we're actually working with and helping them curate the content. We're just a platform in many ways. We're just a vehicle in that context, especially for like the Native Reads podcast. And I recommend, if you want to hear what that sounds like, you can go and check out it's called #NativeReads. If you just type it in Google, the series will come up, and you can kind of see those kind of organic dialogues between elders and other elders, and talking about these historical figures, but also the relevance to this generation.
Amazing. That's such wonderful insight. Thank you for that. We have another question coming in from Bernard, who is a big fan of your show. He believes that you offer hope while covering some very heavy topics. So that's huge. We all appreciate that. But he'd love to know if you could speak to why offering hope is so important when sharing knowledge.
Yeah, I think in the academy, we're trained to identify problems. And I think it's really easy. Like the social media algorithms that we work with often, elevate the most negative and controversial topics to the top of the feed, right? And I think it's very cynical. You can't break out of that code, but we have control of our own feeds and the content we put out. But it's also just to show our listeners like what people are actually doing to build an alternative or to live a different way, or to show that there are other ways of doing things. And I guess like I wouldn't call it so much hope, but I would just say that it's offering possibility. And we often, as academics, we're not trained, and it's actually looked down upon to offer solutions. And I think we take a risk a little bit as a podcast to really kind of promote solutions to things, because that's not really what these social media algorithms are promoting. But I think we need to live in a world where we are taking risks, offering real solutions to real issues. Journalism helps highlight the issues and frames the issues in certain ways. But we have to, as people who are involved in the movement, we actually have to offer an alternative, because I think the fundamental way that we've been subjugated as Indigenous people in general is the taking away of a sense of future, right? And if we're not working towards something, then what are we really doing, right? To really colonize and subjugate people is to take away their sense of self, but also their sense of a future, that things need not always be this way, and that there are communities in struggle, and there are examples that have actually broken those kind of shackles and are beginning to create their worlds, although imperfectly, right? Because we're all human. They are beginning to create those worlds and offer real alternatives and solutions in this moment of terrible, terrible danger, right? And it's easy to get, succumb to that anxiety. I myself have done it, especially coming out of the pandemic. But this, we've gotten a lot of feedback from people who were saying, during the pandemic, this was my lifeline to the world, and that means a lot to me. I mean, not just me, but it shows that we're actually connecting with our listenership, and we are providing, I guess hope would be a good word. We are providing hope and the sense of possibility beyond this kind of nightmarish present that we live in.
That pandemic anxiety level is real. I can attest to that. I think we have time for one more question. So let's grab this one from Sophia, who loves the Red Nation cover art, and would love to know how you decided on a visual identity for your show.
That's a really good question. And this kind of goes back to the question that Vernon asked earlier. But that cover, the Sani, Sani is a Diné Bazad word for a grandmother. And the scarf, that's the floral design that's on our cover art, it actually comes from this kind of broader tradition of Indigenous resistance, where these Navajo grandmothers at Big Mountain, they fought the United States government because they were getting forcefully relocated. But there's these photos of them wearing these Sani scarves. And so the Red Nation adopted that. Obviously we made it the color red because of, who we are as leftists, but also as Indigenous people. We adopted that, and then we just turned that into the cover art because it's beautiful, right? And I think that's also, it's like we have to have beauty in what we do, right? And if you go to a powwow, if you go to a cultural performance of Indigenous people, you'll see the kind of the beauty of colors, and and I think that really kind of reflects who we are, not just as a social movement, but who we are as people. Like, we're trying to put beauty out into the world. And that's a fundamentally different project than to, just always point out the problems of the world, to show that, as they say in Diné Bazad, walk in beauty. Like, that's what we're trying to do with this particular show. And every Indigenous culture has something similar. And, I'm Lakota. So we say that when you wear the color red, it's the prayer of the people that you're wearing. And so you're wearing the hopes and aspirations of a people when you put on that red Sani scarf, but also you're showing that those prayers are beautiful because flowers are beautiful, right? And they may be able to like cut us down every now and then, but you can't stop the spring, and you can't stop the blooming of flowers, and you can't stop the beauty continually renewing itself. And that's really what those Sani scarves represent.
That's incredible. I have to agree with Sophia that I think that it is some truly gorgeous cover art, but I did not know the background to it. So that's wonderful to learn. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up with renewal and beauty and all things podcasting in particular. So thank you so much for your time, Vernon. I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Tess. I appreciate it. Nick, thank you so much. Very grateful for you taking the time and the work that you're doing. We applaud you, and we hope that we can continue to support in any way that we can. Thank you for everybody that showed up in the audience. We know that this is the first time we're doing something like this. We felt like it was important for us to lead any way that we can in this industry. And if you guys want to continue to follow what we do, Acast for the stories on social media, Acast on Twitter. One last thing, if you're looking for a home for your podcast, if you're interested in hosting a podcast, we'd love to be there to support you. We have a promo code that we're giving out to everybody that attended today. The actual code is Aclass, and you can get 6 months off hosting. I just want to shout out the team, everybody who made this possible. We thank you guys so much. These things take time and effort and energy, and it really does take a team to make these things happen. So thank you once again for showing up. You could be anywhere, but you chose to be here, and we'll see you next Aclass. Bye-bye.